Hi, Natalie.
Hi.
So happy that you're here.
So happy to be here.
We were set up on like a blind date, basically, a blind podcast
Yes.
date by
Yes.
the amazing Liz Birnbaum, who shout out to her. But she was so genius because she was like, Abby, you have to talk to Natalie. She's a genetic counselor. Can you tell me exactly what you do? And then we're going to get into why you started in this business. I know it's a deeply personal issue, so let's start there.
Okay, I love it. Most people have no idea what a genetic counselor is, so thank you for asking the
Yes.
question. So genetic counselors are master's level trained in genetics and psychology. And so I think that's also really an important distinction because not many healthcare providers are trained in psychology too. So we basically have this training in the science piece, in-depth genetics, but we also have training in the ability to communicate the complex science and also be able to talk about things that can sometimes come across as hard news or difficult to sometimes process. And so having that ability, basically most genetic counselors work in more traditional hospital-based settings, but now a lot of genetic counselors have branched out, including myself,
Mhm.
into different areas. And our role is basically to help patients understand their DNA. And the world of genetic testing has changed so much since, even in the since the early 2000s. But ultimately, we are supporting patients across helping them understand genetic testing across many specialties. So that can range from prenatal and preconception and pediatrics, which means those getting ready to start a family, pregnancy, and children, all the way to adult onset conditions or adult onset implications. And so basically, our role is to help patients understand their genetics and then help them actually make that actionable in their lives.
Amazing. So let's break down before we get into why you started in this field. Does that mean, okay, so like I had to meet with a genetic counselor when I was doing IVF. Generally, I met the person that was at my maternal fetal medicine doctor's office. She was wonderful. Um, but she's dealing basically with embryos or fetuses, I suppose, at some point. Is that the same sort of testing and understanding as a pediatric genetic counselor? Like what are the differences you're looking for there?
Totally. Such a good question. So, even though genetics is so niche and we already are specialized, each specialty even has their own implications when we're doing genetic testing. And I think a lot of people think that there's one genetic test that you can take that tests for everything, which actually couldn't be farther than the truth. We have so many genetic tests out there now that genetic counselors main or one of their main roles is also to help pick which genetic test fits best for the situation and then help interpret that. And so in genetic testing for prenatal, preconception, IVF space as well, those are completely different genetic tests than those used for pediatrics. And so, and then of course, now something that's also started to occur in the genetic testing world is direct to consumer genetic tests. And so that kind of started to explode after ancestry testing became a thing. But then genetic testing left the health space and entered direct to consumer world. So there are now genetic tests that individuals can order on their own, which is another world of genetic testing. So that is something we always talk about with patients too at the beginning of our session and even before testing, which I don't think people realize too. I think people think, oh, when you go see us, we'll be ordering one genetic test for everyone. We actually, and we'll probably get into this, but my private practice is our genetic counselors. We order many different genetic tests. So we see patients across many different specialties. But again, it's we're picking and choosing which genetic tests are reputable and make sense for the situation. And then helping you understand why we're ordering that test in the first place and then interpreting it and having it make sense for you. And so that's also why our role, becomes so important in the world of genetic testing because from an unbiased perspective, of course.
Obviously.
Because if you go order your own genetic test, or even if a provider who's not a genetic counselor orders a genetic test, sometimes we see the wrong genetic test being ordered or it's misinterpreted. And so that's a huge thing that we help with, is just figuring out which genetic test or tests make sense for you in the first place.
And so when somebody goes for like that initial panel of tests, like I think I paid $99 at my OB's office when I was thinking about maybe getting pregnant. And I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, so there's like the standard. Is that how much of those tests is being covered? Like, is that 100%? I mean, nothing's 100%, but
Mhm.
is that a good enough idea of what you have or what's going on? Might you ultimately need more testing down the road?
Yes. So the short answer is yes, because there's so many genetic tests that can apply to you at different stages of your life. And we have over 20,000 genes in our body. So what has come up now is people have heard of whole genome or whole exome sequencing, which is testing for all of those genes within our body, technically. However, what most people don't realize is there's no way that you can get a report that says 20,000 genes and this is all the variants in every, in on all your genes. And so what happens is the lab that you choose to order that whole huge test picks which variants to report to you. So that's just clarifying that even our largest test actually isn't going to potentially report everything that we think is essential. So with we're more of a I would say like concierge style practice, which means that's why we cover so many specialties as well. So in the world of genetic testing, I actually like to explain this concept called penetrance, which is a very genetic sciencey term, but ultimately it kind of just means impact. So in the world of genetics, our genes kind of lie on a spectrum. So some genes are super impactful in our bodies. Therefore, changes in those genes or mutations or variants in those genes are very impactful. And if you have a variant in those genes, usually that leads to 100% diagnosis of a genetic condition. That would be like cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs disease, Huntington's disease, for example. So that type of genetic testing is usually, when we're looking for those conditions, that is usually run in preconception, prenatal, and pediatrics in different ways. And so we're looking to see risk of those conditions or if the child has one of those genetic conditions. But a lot of our genes and gene changes and variants fall on the other side of the spectrum, where even if someone has a change in those genes, you might have an increased risk, but you're not at 100% diagnosis of that condition. And then we have genes even farther on the end where, we kind of, it's more about human diversity, or maybe there's a slight predisposition and that's where it becomes more essential to look at environmental impacts. So when we're thinking about how the environment and lifestyle plays a role in our genetics, when genes fall on the lower penetrance, medium penetrance side, that's where environment plays a role. Whereas 100% diagnostic conditions, less of a role. So anyways, with all that being said, when we think about that spectrum, that's where genetic tests differ. So when we're doing preconception testing, we're looking at the high risk genes for you and potential to pass anything down. But there's this whole other world that could be beneficial for you to test for. And that's where a lot of the power of genetics lies with when it comes to personalization, prevention, and proactivity of our health. And we can talk about that more, but that's where we oftentimes will order genetic testing for patients as well after they've done the screening type for preconception, for example.
Okay, so let me just make sure I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
There's yes, we clearly see that this variant is off or is missing or right, there's a deletion, whatever. That is going to potentially be a problem. Then there's and this one we know what the problem is, and we know that it's going to cause X, Y, and Z. Then there's, well, these are not 100%, but they're not great. It doesn't really matter. You could still have a child and have a perfectly healthy child, or it's not great. And because you live in such a certain environment, it's going to get worse. Is that what you're saying? Like that's sort of the spectrum in terms of preconception.
Yes, yeah. So when we're thinking preconception, yes, pretty much exactly what you said. And when we get to the other side, where we're not looking at like 100% diagnostic conditions, we're looking at lower risk information. That's where really, we can help optimize lifestyle, diet, nutrition, et cetera, to support that. But it wouldn't be a situation where that would impact fertility or impact having a child with a genetic condition.
Got it. Can you give me like what would be a good example of one of those lower level ones?
Okay, yes. So first I'll go into mid and then I'll go into
Okay.
lower. Mid, I actually like to use cancer genetic testing as an example, which can be sometimes also relevant with Ashkenazi Jewish heritage. So
Yeah.
sometimes individuals have a change mutation in a gene, in a cancer protective gene that can cause them to have an increased risk of cancer, but sometimes it's around a 20 to 30% increased risk. So then if we flip that, that's around 80% that they won't develop cancer. So that is a situation where, okay, you don't have a diagnosis of cancer, but you might have an increased risk. So how can we use that information to be proactive and preventative for you? And then also when we're thinking of preconception, we can talk about implications on, if a child has an increased risk, when they would start, thinking about screening and prevention stuff as well. And then the low penetrance, this is where our practice is unique because our genetic counselors and myself are trained in integrative healthcare. And so this is when we're looking at pathways and more nutrigenetic testing. So if we think about, let's just bring up the inflammatory pathway. So there are certain genes that we know are within the inflammatory pathway. And if someone has changes in those genes, that can cause them to have a sensitivity to inflammatory triggers and have that be turned on. So they might just be inflamed often. So if that's a situation that comes up for them, then we would talk about anti-inflammatory support for that patient. And then I always say we can test children for that information. And then we can see, oh, do we want to help the child with anti-inflammatory support? Another gene example, though, is celiac disease. We can see if you're predisposed to celiac disease, which can be really helpful for children as well. So that's kind of a spectrum versus, okay, if you have, maybe you're carrying a gene that can lead to Tay-Sachs disease. Your partner also carries that gene. You might have a child with Tay-Sachs disease. That information is completely different. So hopefully that's helpful
Yes.
with it.
Yes. So let's, in that scenario, um, tell me if this is right. I think one parent, the percentage of it go moving forward to the child from two parents is like 25% if they're both carriers. Is that right?
Yes,
And so what do you do in that situation? So like I found out I was a carrier of Tay-Sachs. I was like, what? This is crazy. My
yeah,
husband wasn't, so we didn't have to worry about it.
yeah,
Had he been a carrier and we went on to procreate, there's a 25% chance that we would give actual Tay-Sachs to our child or that they would then become a carrier for the gene.
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So yes. And in that space, so also many people are carriers of many things. And I always think it's so surprising. Obviously, I've tested myself. I found out I was a carrier of a condition that can cause childhood deafness. And I was like, where'd this come from? So
Yeah.
it can be.
Like who do I
And
blame?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So funny. And also for listeners too, when we're talking about being a carrier, just quick breakdown of basic genetics. So we have two copies of each gene. We get one from our mom and one from our dad. So sometimes what happens is people have a change or a variant in one copy, but their other one is working well. And so because their other one is working well, they won't have symptoms. But if they pass down the copy that's not working as well, and then their partner has the same situation and passes down their non-working copy, that's when we get a recessive condition like Tay-Sachs disease. That's where the 25% comes in. And
Got it.
so if two partners are carriers of a certain recessive condition, many people are actually surprised that there are options through IVF where it's something like embryo genetic testing where we can help kind of avoid passing down a certain recessive condition. And that's always a decision, for the couple to make. Our role is to help, knowledge about what options are available. I always say too, if couples are not looking into that option, knowledge is still power, because planning ahead can be really helpful. So sometimes there are implications for care when the child is born with a certain recessive condition. And so no matter what decision is made, there are options, and also it can be helpful just to have the knowledge to help plan and prep in many different ways.
Great. So in that, let's just keep using Tay-Sachs because it's a great example.
Yeah.
So let's say I was a carrier. Let's say my husband had been a carrier, and we would have been like, we want to do IVF so that we can create embryos, and then do, I think it's the PGTM. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
And meaning mono, what's the word?
Genic.
PGT, mono,
Yeah.
mono. Okay. You're
Monogenic.
monogenic. You're testing for that one gene. Then you see via that test if the child got inherited the recessive gene, and then you would theoretically transfer an embryo that does not have that gene. That's what you're explaining here? And
Exactly.
PGTM is that test.
Exactly.
And that's different. Many of my listeners are in the fertility world, so they know a lot about PGT testing.
Yeah.
Different than like PGTA, or when I did it originally, it was just called PGT, or PGD maybe even. So why would you want to do a PGTM only? Or would you maybe want to do both? And if you do both, a PGTA, which you'll explain what that is, and a PGTM,
Mhm.
is that two different samples of cells that you're taking, or do you take one sample and test for both?
Good
I know this
question.
is so nitty gritty, but I'm like
Yeah.
so fascinated by it.
I know, it's so true. Yes. Okay. So the benefit of doing PGTM, usually that option exists when we've identified something in the parents already. And so the first step would be parental testing, which sometimes is skipped, but I think that's a really important piece. And I also want to say and mention, I'm sure your listeners, if they're in this space, might have explored this, but sometimes insurance can cover one or both. So it can be helpful to have that knowledge too, and check with your insurance. But the reason that can be helpful is because we're getting specific on which disease can basically, yeah, which disease we're wanting to specifically avoid if possible. Um, if you were to do basically PGTA can look for aneuploidy. So this is checking for chromosomes. So it's almost like another test, another layer of information. It can be beneficial to do both, especially if there's been an identified genetic factor in a parent that we're trying to limit. However, or avoid, sorry. With genetic testing, I think let me think about this too.
Yeah,
Like
I
hopefully you
know.
can edit about this
Of
part.
course. No, but this is, I mean, it would make sense that you need to think about it for a minute.
Yeah, it's especially because we're usually doing preconception before
Right,
PGT.
right.
But I think it's helpful for a patient to consider both or one. It depends on like what we find with parent. So, I mean, all of this can be so complicated, which is why we recommend meeting with a genetic counselor specifically before. But I think it's helpful to also go into, the conversation of, what is the goal, and then what can we find out, and what do we want to find out, etc. I also like to clarify that this type of genetic testing is not it's not a situation where we're doing designer babies, because I always hear about that.
Yes.
um, there's actually a lot of ethics and legality behind what we can and can't test for with PGT testing. So that's just something to consider too. It's not like there's a situation where you're picking hair color and eye color. And I
Yes.
think a lot of people get confused about that. So
Thank you
this
for
is,
saying that because it's
yeah,
my pet peeve when I see those articles.
the worst. And
Yes.
I think, with genetic counseling too, it's people aren't aware, like we have so much training in legality and ethics. And so our role is not to basically design a perfect, quote, perfect baby at all. The goal really is to support with these high risk diseases, and then, supporting with family planning as well, in which what makes sense for the couple.
Okay. I was brought back to celiac, and let me do that, and then we're gonna backtrack a little. But do people develop celiac later in life, or is it something? I feel like I know an adult who was recently diagnosed with celiac. She had no idea that she had it. She had silent celiac. Would she have, had they tested, would they had found that? Or is it something that can develop based on your environmental factors, et cetera?
Love this question. So when we're thinking about genetic testing for celiac disease, we look at the HLA genes, and the HLA genes are part of the immune system. So celiac disease, I think it people don't realize it's actually an autoimmune condition, whereas gluten sensitivity can be more of an allergy. So with celiac disease, when we're looking at genetics, what can happen is we can find that the person has a predisposition for developing it. And what happens is if they have that predisposition, the more gluten they're exposed to, the more likely they'll develop it. And so it can be really helpful, especially as children, to see where they fall on that spectrum. And with celiac genetic testing, it's not black and white. There's actually a spectrum of impact. So you can have low risk, medium risk, high risk, and very high risk. If you're at the very high risk, we usually recommend to limit gluten and potentially avoid gluten altogether because there's a high chance you'll develop it.
Mm.
If you're in the medium category, it's a little bit more complex. You can develop it later, or there's a chance if you limit your gluten enough that you won't develop it. But the interesting thing about genetic testing for celiac is if you have no markers, you rule it out. And that can be really helpful because with the diagnosis of celiac is actually very complex. The antibody blood test that is often run isn't perfect. A patient usually has to consume lots and lots of gluten before taking that test in order for them to show if they're having a reaction. And some people will not consume a lot of gluten regularly, then take that test and test negative, but they might have celiac. So that's where genetic testing can be this added layer to be really helpful in determining that without having to do an endoscopy and a biopsy.
Hmm.
Um,
And my
uh,
friend who found it through a colonoscopy
yeah,
routine, first
exactly.
colonoscopy.
Exactly. And I actually have personal experience with this myself. So I'm really passionate about testing children for this genetic marker because I was also undiagnosed celiac until I
Mm.
was 25 years old. And that was caused so many GI issues that I couldn't figure out. And so, I tested negative on the antibody, but no one told me that I'd eat gluten beforehand. So I ended up doing an endoscopy, figuring it out. But then I did my genetics and realized I was at high risk. So if my parents knew that, when I was younger, it could have been really helpful information. So, and then the ruling out component is also really helpful because then we can say, okay, there's maybe other factors contributing to gut issues, but or you might have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, but we don't have to worry about this autoimmune response.
Okay, so that's a perfect segue into you and why you do this work. How did you
Yeah.
end up in this field? I know you're extremely passionate about it, so tell me why.
Yes. Okay. So my story with genetic counseling, I really wasn't exposed to this world of genetic counseling as a career until my senior year of college, and I was studying biology and I had no idea what I wanted to do with it. I was like, oh, I don't really want to go into med school. I don't want to go into the lab, but I was a people person. I wanted to work with patients and I loved understanding the human body. And so I found out about genetic counseling. I was like, this makes so much sense. This is exactly what I want to do. My brother he's been diagnosed with many mental health, disorders, kind of broadly diagnosed with neurodivergence. But growing up, I, obviously was really close to that. And so someone who came to speak to us, she was in pediatrics genetics. So originally I set out to do pediatric genetic counseling, but during my master's program, I actually started feeling more connected to realizing that genetics can be such a tool in the oncology world and supporting patients to find, like, if they find that they might be at high risk, supporting them with proactive care.
Mm.
And I was also going through my own health struggles and really just found proactive care and personalized care to be really beneficial for me, and kind of saw that with my family in a different light. So I graduated and I went into oncology genetic counseling.
Wow.
Um, But when I was there and I was very starry-eyed and was like, oh my God, I finally get to see patients on my own. I was in the hospital setting. I had a pretty big role, as most genetic counselors do, where, the main genetics provider that the patient is seeing, and then we're part of this care team. We work with the oncologist. So I loved pieces of it, but I started to feel a little bit disconnected because I really went into it with this passion of proactive care. And I felt like a lot of our patients were being sent to us when there was already a diagnosis of cancer. And so my role started becoming giving patients information if their disease was, had this genetic cause when they were already diagnosed. And during that time, two things happened. One, I was also giving the responsibility to start testing patients for Alzheimer's and dementia. And the same thing started to happen where we were getting patients who were already diagnosed. And then at that same time, my father was actually diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And that flipped my role from a provider to a patient, or a daughter of a patient. And so I started feeling this real disconnect where I started seeing the lack of discussion of nutrition, lifestyle, supplementation, in health and especially in the role of dementia and oncology and cancer, where we know that nutrition, lifestyle, and supplementation play a big role. So ultimately, I kind of had this moment where I felt like I needed to do more, because what started happening is I would then see patients of people who are diagnosed, family members, and tell them they're at risk. But I was kind of restricted to just say, okay, do more screenings. And I do feel like screenings can be so helpful, especially for cancer, catching things early. But I was like, there's so much more we can do for these diseases. And going through the appointments with my father, he was going through chemo and just told to eat ice cream or whatever his heart desired. And I was like, but there's so much more the human body can benefit from. So that's ultimately what led me to seek more of trying to approach care from an integrative perspective. And when I went to go try to look to see if we can find if there's a world that exists of integrative genetic counseling, I didn't see it. So that's when I started my own practice, Golden Genetics, which has morphed now into more of a general genetics clinic, but approaching it from a whole person care. So we not only utilize genetics as a tool, but then we'll help optimize different areas using genetics and throughout different stages of life.
Amazing. So who was your ideal? I know you have many, but give me an example of one ideal client that comes to you.
Yes. Okay. So such a good question. And my marketing team hates when I say this because I just say everyone.
Yeah, I get
And
it.
they're like, no, you have to have someone, but this is why. So basically, I developed a 4P framework, which I think is really helpful to explain
Yeah.
why it can be beneficial for everyone. But then I'll answer to, who I think could really benefit. So the 4P framework, there's this. So what I started to understand is that genetics is can be a tool to be used in so many different aspects. And I also like to explain this concept of lifespan versus health span. So lifespan is increasing the numbers of years. Health span is increasing the quality of those years. Lifespan is about extension, and health span is more about can you do the things you want to do later in life? And I think we can all agree that really the goal is not just to live long, but it's also to live well and be able to play with our grandkids and do what we want to do instead of, potentially having dependency living in a wheelchair. And so I developed this framework using genetics as the tool to help increase both. And so the 4Ps of the framework are first, personalization. So personalization is what works for you. So this isn't about what works for your friend, and it's not about what works for your favorite influencer. So this is about, personalization, what works for you. Prevention is about understanding what diseases you might be predisposed to, and then how can we prevent those altogether? So that's where we use research to be very specific. So sometimes patients will say, my friend told me to do the breast cancer genes. I'm like, well, actually, when we do genetic testing, it's more about heart disease for her, not breast cancer. So a personalizing prevention and then being preventative. The third P is proactivity. So we know that we can't prevent all diseases. I never want to make someone feel that they're blamed because you can live a perfect healthy lifestyle and still develop a disease. And we know that. And so proactivity is about catching things early. And we know diseases caught early is a much different story than diseases caught late. Cancer, for example, caught at stage 0 or 1 is usually a surgery. Cancer caught at stage 3 or 4 usually entails surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy with no promise of that working. And then the last P is precision. So this is actually genetic testing that can be used to be precise with treatment. And so an example is pharmacogenomics. Pharmacogenomics is the study of how your body responds to medication based on your DNA. A very highly underutilized tool. So that can be helpful for precision. And so each of these P's we can optimize with genetics. So personalization, we can use things like functional genomics, nutrigenomics, and sometimes diagnostic tests. Prevention, this is where more of those mid to higher penetrance genetic tests comes in. Same with proactivity, and then precision pharmacogenetics. And also there's testing that you can do if you are in active treatment that many people don't realize too. So, I think it can apply to a lot of people. But I always say, especially people who are experiencing complex symptoms or something that maybe their doctors just can't seem to figure out. That can be infertility, but sometimes that also is like migraines, brain fog, lack of energy, chronic fatigue, just a lot of potential blanket autoimmune conditions that have been diagnosed. Genetics really shines there. We always seem to find root cause answers. And then, I think the infertility world too, it can be helpful to see if there's anything genetic contribution wise, and I think a lot of patients don't do genetics as a first step there.
Yeah.
So that's
Okay. And you do kids too. So you do pediatric at your practice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. And with pediatric testing that we do the first P, which is personalization testing. So we don't test children under 18 for adult onset risk conditions, and that's due to autotomy. So that's an ethical consideration. But we do test them for personalization, such as the celiac genes, the cellular pathways. All of that information can be helpful. And then if a child does come to us, though, already experiencing symptoms such as autism spectrum disorder or developmental delay, then we do also do high-risk diagnostic testing for those patients as well. Or if there's pediatric cancer, for example, we will test for the cancer genes.
Now, can somebody contact you for a consult who doesn't live? You're in California, right? Southern California.
Yes.
Do you mostly do in person? Do you do online? Do you do education training anywhere? And if somebody wanted to consult you with embryo questions or, right, you get a report sometimes about what's happening with your embryos, can they do that or do you mostly work in person?
Good question. Yeah, so we're actually fully telehealth. So
Okay.
we can see patients anywhere in California, and then we have select states that we can see patients in depending on licensure. So we have a list on our website, but we have licensure in New Jersey, Florida, and then we also can see patients in Colorado, Texas, Arizona, and many other select states. So if you are in a state that we can see you in, we can offer pre-test counseling, but also results review. So if you do have genetic information, we can help support making sense of what that means.
Breaking it down. And does insurance cover this generally?
Sometimes. So
Yeah.
it's very dependent on the case. It's a range. So sometimes insurance does cover the testing. Other times we can provide a super bill, or you can use FSA or HSA. So we have different options. If it's proactive testing, for example, insurance is unfortunately less likely to cover it, but we have options for support with payment.
Okay. And my last question, well, one of my last, I always say my last, it's never my last.
Yeah.
Are do you feel that AI is going to enhance or inhibit your business?
Love this question. So I actually personally think that AI has such good, there's a lot of use to AI. And so that being said, genetics and a genetic interpretation is not one of them. And I'll explain why. So first, I've had patients who have submitted their results to ChatGPT, for example, and they had us review what ChatGPT said. And ChatGPT actually got all of the genetic variants backwards. So they said something was bad when it's actually normal. So a lot of misinformation happening there. And I've tried it myself with many of my own testing, and it's given wrong information where I've said, actually, that variant is not what you're saying. And then it goes, oh, you're right. So
Right. They're like, you're right. You're so beautiful. You're so
yeah,
smart. And also,
yeah.
yeah.
So that's one piece. And then the second thing that AI doesn't provide, which is essential in healthcare, is context. So AI, and there's actually a lot of companies that have come out where it's like you get an AI plan based on your genetics, which even if the AI might be accurate, one, it might give you recommendations that actually don't work for you. It might give you two, it might give you recommendations that are overwhelming. So it'll give you, 15 different diet recommendations that might counteract with each other just because it's like, well, this variant says this and this variant says this. So it's not putting it into context. And then the third is the other contextual piece is like, what stage of life are you at? What actually makes sense for you at this time? Have you done blood testing? How can we look at that as well? Some other wearable data, like all of the data taking into account with the genetics. Maybe you have allergies or reactions to certain things that AI can't, know. And then the last thing is counseling. So, there is emotion that can come up with this information, and AI is just not going to know how to
Right.
support that. And so that's also where, our training comes in, where we can help, navigate that emotional aspect with you. So it's making sense and supporting you throughout that information processing period.
So helpful. Okay. Really, my last question. Is there any like life advice that you received or like to give that you think about often on a daily basis, on a regular basis with patients that you want to give to our audience?
That's a good question.
It can even be a cliche like, I don't know. Reason I always say a reason,
Uh,
a season, or a lifetime. Nothing lasts for more than a reason, a season, unless for,
mm, I
something
love
like
that.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll tell you two ones.
Okay.
So the first one, something that I review a lot with patients now is that I always say that the goal with health is not perfection because I think when we look at the world of prevention and longevity, we actually know that stress is a huge cortisol production is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, most harmful things we can do for our health. And so there's so much information out there now. There's so much online. A lot of patients, I think, come to us with kind of this feeling of overwhelm that everything seems bad for them or that they can't do anything. And it just seems very overwhelming. And I always tell patients that the goal is not perfection. And really, that's where genetics can help personalize what may be best for you to focus on and then let go and make sure you're enjoying life. And, I think, yeah, the biggest thing is just, having fun and not, we don't want you to feel like, anyone to feel like they're doing everything wrong or right. It's more about how can we support ourselves individually and then let go.
Hmm.
So I tell patients that a lot. And I think that's come up a lot with everything that exists online now. And then I think the other piece too that I think has just changed myself in the way I practice, but I think also can apply to the thing that I just went over is that if we really are able to view and switch our mindset from like when you have a tough time or something goes like wrong in your mind, it's really not about viewing it as a failure, but viewing it as something we can learn from and grow from. And I feel like that's helped me and can be so helpful for patients too. So it's not about self-hate. It's just about, okay, letting go. What can I learn from this? And then moving on, because the more that we're stuck in that self-hate, I'm a failure mindset, the more we'll hold ourselves back, and more of the rabbit hole will go down. So it's about maybe finding what can we learn from that, and then letting go and being more gentle with ourselves.
Oh, that's such a good one. Natalie, you're such a wealth of information. Thank you so much. We'll link out
Um,
to where people can find you.
well, thank you so much for having me on.